My name is Caroline. I am 35 years old, though my sister loves to tell people I am 36, just to make my supposed failures sound more pathetic. I was sitting at $1,000 table at a high-end Manhattan restaurant quietly cutting my steak when she decided to make her move. She looked around the VIP room making sure everyone was listening and asked how I planned to survive another lonely Christmas as a middle-aged spinster. She had no idea that my response would completely dismantle her husband's career, send our parents to federal prison, and expose a billion-dollar empire. Before I tell you how a single phone call brought my toxic family to their knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to defend your worth against the people who should love you most. The laughter around the table was immediate and cruel. Ashley, my 31-year-old sister, leaned against her husband, Donovan. She deliberately adjusted her hand so the dining room chandelier would catch the light on her 2-carat diamond ring. You are already 36 and still single, Caroline. It must be so tough spending the holidays alone in that tiny apartment of yours. My mother. Catherine took a slow sip of her Chardonnay and waved a manicured hand dismissively. Oh, calm down, Ashley. She is just joking. Although, Caroline, let us be honest. You are pushing 40 doing freelance admin work from home. You really should lower your standards. Nobody wants a woman with your kind of baggage. I did not react. I had spent my entire life absorbing their casual cruelty. Growing up, Ashley was the golden child paraded around country clubs, while I was the scapegoat blamed for every family misfortune. I simply finished slicing my meat, took a deliberate bite, and wiped my mouth with the linen napkin. I set my crystal glass down on the table and looked directly into my mother's eyes. Do not worry about me. I have been married for a long time. Catherine froze mid-toast. The wine sloshed dangerously close to the rim of her glass. The laughter in the room died instantly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Donovan, my African-American brother-in-law, scoffed loudly. He adjusted his expensive silk tie, leaning forward with the absolute arrogance of a man who had recently been promoted to chief financial officer of a major corporate subsidiary. Mayor, he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. To who? The delivery guy. You were fired from your father's accounting firm 5 years ago for embezzlement. You have been hiding in that cheap condo ever since. Do not tell me you hired an actor off the internet just to survive the holidays. I did not say a word in response. I simply reached over with my left hand and slowly pulled off my silk glove, laying it neatly beside my plate. Under the restaurant's brilliant lighting, a massive, flawless blue diamond ring caught the light, casting sharp blue reflections across the white tablecloth. But it was not the sheer carat size that made Donovan's jaw drop. It was the thick platinum band intricately carved with a crossed shield crest. Donovan stood up so fast, his heavy wooden chair crashed to the floor. Where the hell did you steal that? He demanded, his voice echoing off the walls. Ashley grabbed his arm, looking frantic and embarrassed by the sudden outburst. Donovan, what are you talking about? It is probably glass. She bought it at a pawn shop to save face. It is not glass, Donovan roared, pointing a trembling finger directly at my hand. That is the Prescott family crest. I work for Prescott Industries. I know for a fact that our billionaire CEO, Alexander Prescott, has a private marriage on paper. The entire corporate board whispers about it. But there is zero chance in hell a man like that married a pathetic failure like you. His chest heaved as he reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his phone. His eyes were wild with a mix of vindictive triumph and corporate panic. You are impersonating the CEO's family. That is a massive security breach and corporate fraud. I am calling the executive board's Tier 1 internal security right now. They will have you arrested before dessert arrives. Catherine shrieked, slamming her hands flat on the table. Caroline, are you insane? Take that stolen ring off right now before you drag this entire family to prison with you. You have always been a disaster, but this is a new low. Richard, my father finally spoke up, his face flushed red with anger. You have always been a liability to our reputation. If Donovan makes that call, I will not spend a single dime of my company's money to bail you out. You are on your own. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. The chaos around me felt entirely detached from the calm certainty I held inside. Let him call, I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. Donovan sneered, looking at me like I was a cornered animal. He hit dial on his phone and put it on speaker, wanting everyone to hear my downfall. 1 second passed. 2 seconds passed. Suddenly, from inside my designer handbag resting on the floor, a phone began to ring. It was not my personal cell phone. It was a harsh, encrypted satellite ringtone that cut sharply through the tense silence of the VIP room. I casually reached into my bag, pulled out a sleek, heavy black device, and turned the brightly lit screen toward Donovan. The caller ID flashed in bright red letters across the digital display. Incoming. Donovan Hayes. CFO Tier 3, code red. All the blood drained from Donovan's face. His phone slipped from his hand, hitting the thick carpet with a dull thud. The bright red flashing light on my digital screen illuminated the absolute terror in Donovan's eyes. I watched his throat bob as he swallowed hard. His expensive, boastful bravado completely evaporated into the chilled air of the restaurant. I pressed my thumb against the red decline button. The ringing stopped instantly. At the exact same moment, the speaker on Donovan's phone beeped a harsh, automated tone announcing the security call had been terminated by executive override. I slipped my phone quietly back into my designer handbag. I smiled at him, my expression perfectly neutral. As I said, Donovan, corporate emergencies go through me first. Do you have an emergency you would like to report? He backed away from the table, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. He looked blindly at his phone, then back at my face, trying to process how the unemployed sister-in-law he loved to humiliate was suddenly holding the leash to his entire career. He knew exactly what a code red alert meant at Prescott Industries. It meant a direct, verified threat to the chief executive officer or his immediate family. The realization that he had just triggered a security breach against his own boss's wife was visibly paralyzing him. My mother could not stand it. Catherine hated nothing more than losing control of a room, especially to me. She slammed her crystal wine glass down on the heavy mahogany table so hard the delicate stem nearly snapped. The sharp, violent crack echoed through the private dining area, snapping everyone out of their stunned silence. I do not care what kind of cheap hacker trick you downloaded on your phone to play a prank on your brother-in-law. Catherine spat, her face twisting with sudden rage. She completely ignored the massive diamond ring resting on my hand. And I do not care about your ridiculous fake jewelry. You are not fooling anyone here, Caroline. You are a failure, and it is time you finally made yourself useful to this family. She aggressively reached into her Prada handbag, pulled out a thick stack of legal papers, and threw them across the table. They slid over the white linen and stopped right next to my dinner plate. I glanced down at the bold print stamped across the top page. It was a property transfer deed for my condominium. I picked up my silver fork again, completely unbothered by her dramatic display. Are we conducting real estate transactions over Christmas dinner now? I asked. Sign it, Catherine ordered. Her voice was sharp, vibrating with the exact tone of authority she used when I was a teenager to force me into silent submission. You owe this family $50,000. Your father and I had to take out a massive loan to pay for Ashley's wedding 3 years ago. We sacrificed our financial stability to make sure she had the lavish day she deserved. It is time you paid us back. Ashley adjusted her posture, running a hand through her perfectly styled blonde hair, looking entirely too pleased with herself. It is the absolute least you can do, Caroline. My wedding cost an absolute fortune because Donovan and I had a certain high-class image to maintain. An image you completely ruined. Do you know how embarrassing it was to explain to Donovan's wealthy corporate relatives why my own sister was not standing in the bridal party? You were not in the bridal party because you uninvited me 2 weeks before the ceremony, I reminded her. I kept my voice perfectly level, refusing to give them the emotional reaction they were desperate to provoke. You specifically told me my off-the-rack dress would clash with your custom-imported floral arrangements. Ashley waved her hand dismissively, rolling her eyes. That is completely beside the point. The point is that Mom and Dad are drowning in the debt from my wedding. You have no husband, no children, and no real career. You do not need a 2-bedroom condo in the city. You can move into a cheaper studio somewhere far away from us. Sign the condo over to Mom and Dad so they can sell it and clear the family debt. It is simply the logical thing to do. Richard, my father, leaned forward heavily against the table. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my face. You have been a massive leech on this family since the day you were born. We paid for your upbringing. We paid for your state college tuition. And we graciously gave you a job at my accounting firm, which you repaid by nearly ruining our business reputation. You owe us every single penny of that $50,000. We have the transfer paperwork already notarized by my corporate lawyers. All you have to do is put your name on the dotted line and walk away. I looked at the three of them. A mother who demanded I render myself homeless to pay for a party I was banned from attending. A sister who felt completely entitled to steal my only asset to cover her lavish, irresponsible lifestyle. A father who rewrote history to make me the villain of a financial crime I never committed. Donovan was still standing perfectly still by his chair, staring fixedly at my blue diamond ring, completely ignoring the screaming match happening in front of him. He was a high-level finance executive. He knew the exact cost of a custom platinum band from the Prescott estate. He was silently doing the math in his head, realizing that the woman his wife's family was trying to extort for $50,000 was wearing a ring worth more than their entire combined net worth. I picked up the property deed and flipped slowly to the second page. I read the predatory legal jargon carefully. You expect me to just hand over the title to my home, a home I paid for with my own hard-earned money, a home you never contributed a single cent toward. Catherine scoffed loudly, a harsh sound of pure mockery. Your own money. Do not make me laugh. You do not have any money. You are a glorified freelance assistant scraping by on minimum wage. We know you are struggling, Caroline. We are actually doing you a favor. If you sign the condo over to us right now, we will gracefully wipe away the massive debt you owe this family. We will even let you keep whatever cheap secondhand furniture you have sitting in there. They were so incredibly confident in their abuse. They had spent over 3 decades treating me like a convenient stepping stone, using my quiet nature as explicit permission to trample all over my boundaries. They genuinely believed I would cave under their coordinated pressure sign, away my only financial security, and disappear into the night, just to earn a tiny fraction of their conditional approval. But the scared, desperate woman they used to bully died 5 years ago, right around the time they threw her out into the freezing snow to protect their golden child. I dropped the deed back onto the table. I smoothed out the pages with deliberate slowness, making sure the paper was perfectly aligned with my wine glass. Then I looked up at my mother with a calm, freezing glare that stopped her dead in her tracks. I am not signing anything, Catherine. I am not paying for Ashley's overpriced, pretentious wedding, and I am certainly not giving you my home. Catherine's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She stood up abruptly, her heavy chair screeching harshly against the polished hardwood floor. She leaned entirely over the table, her hands planted firmly on the white tablecloth, bringing her face mere inches from mine. She looked directly at the massive blue diamond resting gracefully on my left hand. "Sign the deed right now!" she hissed, her voice dropping to a vicious, threatening whisper that carried across the quiet room. "Sign it now, or we call the police and tell them you stole that ring just like you stole from our company 5 years ago." The threat hung in the air of the private dining room, toxic and desperate. Catherine was breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her expensive silk blouse, fully expecting me to crumble. For 35 years, that exact tone of voice had been her ultimate weapon. It was the voice that demanded absolute obedience, the voice that dictated I was nothing but a punching bag for this family. I looked at the property deed sitting next to my plate. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not offer a frantic defense. I calmly reached out with my left hand, the blue diamond, catching the ambient light, and slid the fraudulent property deed right back across the white linen tablecloth. It stopped inches from my mother's clutching fingers. Then I reached into my designer handbag for the final time. I pulled out a thick bound stack of financial documents bearing the official seal of First National Bank. I dropped the heavy stack directly on top of their deed. The loud smack of paper hitting the table made Ashley jump in her seat. I kept my eyes locked on Catherine. "You did not mortgage your house to pay for Ashley's wedding," I said, my voice dangerously soft, but carrying clearly across the room. You did not sacrifice your financial stability. What you did, Catherine, was commit first-degree mortgage fraud. Catherine's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened, but the arrogant words she had prepared completely vanished. I leaned forward, making sure every single person at the table could hear exactly what kind of people my parents truly were. 3 years ago, I continued, you and Richard walked into a branch of First National Bank. You used a falsified power of attorney document and a forged signature to take out a home equity line of credit. But you did not take it out on your own estate. You took out a $50,000 line of credit against my condominium. You stole my equity to pay for your golden child's extravagant wedding, and now that the balloon payments are due, you want me to sign the property over entirely to cover up your federal crime. Donovan whipped his head around to look at his wife, then at his parents-in-law. As a corporate financial executive, he knew exactly what a fraudulent home equity line of credit meant. His hands gripped the edge of the table. You forged her signature on a real estate asset, Donovan asked, his voice cracking with sudden panic. Do you have any idea what the federal penalties are for identity theft and bank fraud? I work for a multi-billion-dollar corporation. If the federal authorities audit my extended family and find out I am connected to mortgage fraud, I will lose my financial licenses. I could go to prison just for being associated with this. Ashley slammed her hands on the table, glaring at her husband. Shut up, Donovan. Whose side are you on? She turned her furious gaze to me, completely unashamed of the crime her parents had committed on her behalf. You owed me that wedding, Caroline. You ruined my bridal shower by refusing to pay for the country club rental. Mom and Dad simply took what you owed this family. It is your fault for being so selfish. I stared at my younger sister, absolutely astounded by her delusional entitlement. My fault, I echoed, keeping my tone deadly calm. Let us talk about who owes who, Ashley. Let us talk about what happened 5 years ago when I was conveniently fired from our father's logistics company. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting toward the restaurant door as if looking for an escape route. Caroline, he warned in a low, gravelly voice. Do not push this. I ignored him completely. You told everyone I was fired for embezzlement, I said, raising my voice just enough to ensure Donovan caught every word. You told the entire extended family that I stole money from the corporate accounts, and that you were mercifully hiding my crime by quietly terminating me. But we all know the truth. I was the lead accountant. I tracked every single fraudulent wire transfer. I knew exactly who was draining the company accounts to buy designer bags, fund luxury vacations to Cabo, and maintain a fake rich lifestyle on social media. I pointed directly at Ashley. It was you. You stole almost $500,000 from Dad's company. I brought the audit directly to him. And what did our loving father do? He realized his perfect golden daughter was a thief. To protect your pristine reputation, he deleted the audit, fired me, and publicly blamed me for the missing funds. He threw me out into the snow in the middle of December, completely blacklisting me from the industry just to keep you out of prison. Ashley's face turned a violent shade of red. You are a liar. You are just jealous because I am beautiful and married to a successful man, while you are a miserable spinster making up stories. I tapped the stack of First National Bank statements. Bank records do not lie, Ashley. Just like the security footage from the notary public does not lie. When you hold a 15% stake in First National Bank through a private equity fund, the fraud department is more than happy to hand over all the surveillance tapes showing exactly who walked into the branch to forge a signature. Catherine looked like she was going to be physically ill. She grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his expensive suit jacket. Richard, she gasped, breathing heavily. Richard, do something. She has the bank files. She has... My father had finally heard enough. The facade of the distinguished wealthy patriarch completely shattered. Richard pushed his chair back with violent force and stood up, towering over the table. The veins in his neck were visibly pulsing against his stiff white collar. His face was twisted in a mask of pure, unrestrained rage. You listen to me, you ungrateful wretch, Richard snarled, pointing a shaking finger inches from my face. I do not care what pieces of paper you managed to steal from that bank. I am Richard, the chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar logistics empire. I have a legal team that costs more per hour than you will make in your entire miserable life. If you do not sign that deed right now and hand over those bank files, I will unleash my lawyers on you. I will bury you under so many defamation lawsuits, you will never see the light of day. I will tie you up in court until you are bankrupt homeless and begging me for a scrap of bread. He leaned down, planting his knuckles on the table, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me, the way he always had. You are nothing but a discarded mistake, Caroline. You will sign that property over to us, or I will personally make sure you are completely destroyed. The threat hung heavily in the air of the private dining room. Richard stood towering over the table, his knuckles pressed hard against the white linen, his face flushed a deep, violent shade of red. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the familiar fear to wash over my face, the same fear that used to silence me whenever he raised his voice. He fully expected me to apologize, to slide the bank files back into my purse, and to surrender to his authority. Instead, I looked up at him and laughed. It was a genuine ringing laugh that bounced off the crystal chandeliers and echoed against the soundproof walls of the VIP room. The sheer absurdity of his arrogant posturing was suddenly too much to hold in. Catherine recoiled in her chair, clutching her pearl necklace as if my laughter had physically struck her. "Are you entirely out of your mind?" she hissed, looking around nervously to ensure the restaurant staff were not witnessing her family fall apart. "Your father just told you he is going to destroy your life, and you sit there laughing like a lunatic." I stopped laughing, but the cold smile remained fixed on my face. "I am laughing because he is threatening me with a ghost," I said calmly. I reached into my bag for the final time. I pulled out a thick-bound legal document printed on heavy stock paper. Without a moment of hesitation, I tossed it directly into the center of Richard's plate. The heavy document landed right on top of his expensive steak. A splash of dark sauce splattered across the crisp white cover page, but the bold black letters printed at the top were impossible to ignore. United States Federal Bankruptcy Court. Richard froze completely. The aggressive posture vanished in an instant, replaced by a sudden sickening paralysis. His eyes locked onto the document wide and terrified, as if a venomous snake had just been dropped onto his dinner plate. "Let us talk about this incredibly powerful corporate legal team you plan to unleash on me," I said, resting my elbows on the table and leaning forward. "Let us talk about this massive logistics empire you claim to rule. You cannot afford to hire a single lawyer, Richard. Your company has not been a multi-million-dollar empire for a very long time. You filed for corporate bankruptcy 2 years ago." Ashley gasped loudly, her hand flying to her mouth. She whipped her head toward her father, her eyes wide with panic. "Dad, what is she talking about? Tell me she is making this up. Our company makes tens of millions of dollars a year." "It makes absolutely nothing," I corrected her sharply. "The company started bleeding cash the moment they fired the only competent accountant they had just to cover up your massive theft. They have been entirely insolvent for 24 months. They do not own the corporate offices anymore. They do not own the delivery fleet. It is all a hollow shell." Donovan reached across the table and snatched the document right off Richard's plate, completely ignoring the sauce staining his expensive suit cuff. As a high-level financial executive, his eyes scanned the legal text with rapid, practiced precision. His jaw tightened with every line he read. The arrogant smirk he had worn all evening melted into an expression of profound, utter disgust. He threw the document back down and glared at my father. "You are completely bankrupt," Donovan demanded, his voice rising in disbelief. "You sit around my house drinking my expensive scotch, bragging about your massive investment portfolios, and you are literally bankrupt. How the hell have you been paying for your country club memberships? How did you buy Ashley that new Porsche last month if your company is dead?" I answered for him. Because Richard could not stand the idea of his wealthy golf buddies finding out he was a complete failure. So to maintain the illusion of a dynasty, he went searching for a lifeline. He bypassed the traditional banks because they already knew his credit was garbage. Instead, he went to the private equity sector. He took out a highly toxic, predatory $10 million corporate loan from an anonymous investment firm called Vanguard Capital. Catherine stared at her husband in absolute horror. "Richard, is this true?" she whispered, her voice trembling with the terrifying realization that her entire socialite lifestyle was a complete fabrication. Did you take out a $10 million loan? Richard straightened his jacket, desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny shred of authority he had left. He puffed out his chest, refusing to look his furious son-in-law in the eye. He forced a condescending smirk onto his face and looked down at me. You think you are so incredibly smart, Caroline. He scoffed, his voice dripping with false bravado. Yes, I took a loan from Vanguard Capital. It is a standard corporate restructuring strategy, something a low-level administrative assistant like you could never possibly comprehend. The managing partners at Vanguard believe in my business model. My investors know I'm going to turn things around. In fact, I have a meeting with their executive board next week to secure an extension on my credit line. Richard slammed his fist on the table, pointing at me with renewed, desperate arrogance. The people who run Vanguard Capital have more money, more influence, and more ruthless power than you could ever dream of. They have my back. When I tell them that some bitter, estranged daughter is trying to hit me with bogus fraud claims, they will use their own massive legal department to bury you. You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. I let him finish his pathetic, boastful speech. I let him stand there clinging to the imaginary protection of his faceless billionaire investors. I looked at Ashley, who was breathing heavily, desperate for her father to be right. I looked at Donovan, who was watching me with a sudden creeping realization that he had wildly underestimated the woman sitting across from him. Then I looked directly into Richard's eyes. I leaned forward, dropping my voice to a sharp, deadly whisper that cut right through his fragile illusions. You are not having a meeting with the executive board next week, Richard. Vanguard Capital does not believe in your business model. Vanguard Capital gave you that $10 million loan specifically because we wanted the collateral. We wanted the leverage to destroy you the exact second you stepped out of line. Richard blinked, his face suddenly going completely slack. He repeated, his voice barely a breath. I smiled, tapping my blue diamond ring against the table. Yes, we. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Capital, and I just bought your debt. The absolute silence in the VIP dining room was deafening. The faint sound of jazz music and clinking crystal from the main restaurant outside felt like it belonged to an entirely different universe. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his brain desperately tried to reject the reality of my statement. He gripped the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. That is impossible! Richard finally stammered, his voice stripped of all its previous booming authority. Vanguard Capital is a global entity. You are just a bitter, unemployed accountant who got fired. You do not have the capital, the network, or the intelligence to run a private equity firm. You are lying. I did not bother to argue with him. I calmly reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my iPad. I unlocked the screen with a single tap, opened the encrypted real estate portfolio file, and slid the device smoothly across the white linen tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of him. Read it yourself, Richard. He looked down at the glowing screen. Catherine leaned over his shoulder, her eyes wide with frantic desperation. On the screen was the finalized court-approved digital deed for their sprawling 8-bedroom estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The estate that had been in our family name for decades. The estate where they hosted their lavish, pretentious charity galas to show off their fake wealth. Under the section detailing the current legal owner, the text was undeniable. Property transferred in full to Vanguard Capital LLC due to breach of contract and severe loan default. Catherine let out a sharp, breathless shriek, covering her mouth with both hands. My house, she gasped, her voice trembling violently. You stole my house! You malicious, ungrateful little brat, you stole my house! I did not steal anything, I said, keeping my gaze locked on my mother. You leveraged your primary residence against a highly toxic corporate loan, just so you could buy Ashley a yacht for her honeymoon and keep paying the lease on your luxury cars. You defaulted on that loan 3 months ago. I legally foreclosed on the collateral, as per the exact terms of the contract you signed. You are currently trespassing on my property. I have given the estate manager instructions to change the locks by tomorrow morning. Total panic erupted. Catherine buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the illusion of her high society life shattered into a million pieces. Richard sank back into his chair, looking like a man who had just been handed a death sentence. The dynasty he had bragged about all evening was officially dead, and the daughter he had treated like garbage was the one holding the shovel. But Ashley was not crying. The golden child did not know how to grieve, she only knew how to throw tantrums when she was denied what she wanted. Her face twisted into a mask of pure vicious rage. She slammed both of her hands onto the table, rattling the silverware, and turned her fury entirely onto her husband. "Do something!" Ashley screamed at Donovan. Her voice was shrill, echoing off the soundproof walls. "You are the chief financial officer of Prescott Industries. You manage billions of dollars. You are supposed to be a powerful executive. Are you just going to sit there and let this pathetic spinster take my family's estate? Destroy her." Donovan looked incredibly trapped. He was a corporate bully, but he understood the financial landscape better than anyone else at the table. He knew that Vanguard Capital was not a small, easy target. He knew that a legal battle against a private equity firm that held legitimate default paperwork would be a nightmare. He hesitated, looking nervously from the iPad to his furious wife. Ashley saw his hesitation and her eyes narrowed with absolute disgust. "Are you a man or a coward?" she demanded loudly, humiliating him right in front of her parents. "I married a top-tier executive, not a useless token suit who lets his wife's family get robbed and thrown out onto the street. If you cannot protect my family from her, then what exactly are you good for, Donovan?" The insult to his manhood hit Donovan exactly where Ashley knew it would. His fragile, arrogant ego flared up, instantly overriding his professional caution. His jaw clenched tightly as he glared at me. He completely abandoned logic in a desperate bid to reassert his dominance and save face in front of his wife. "You think you are completely untouchable because you run some boutique equity firm?" Caroline Donovan sneered, standing up and aggressively buttoning his suit jacket. "You think holding a few predatory loans makes you a titan of industry? Prescott Industries eats firms like Vanguard Capital for breakfast. We crush companies twice your size just for sport." He pulled his phone out of his pocket, holding it up like a weapon. "I have the direct private emergency line to Alexander Prescott himself." Donovan boasted, his chest puffed out with toxic pride. He is a ruthless billionaire who protects his top executives at all costs. "When I call him right now and tell him that a rogue predatory equity firm is aggressively harassing his chief financial officer and trying to extort my family, he will not just send his lawyers. He will have his legal team freeze every single asset Vanguard holds by Monday morning. He will have you audited, investigated, and dismantled before you can even step foot back in your cheap apartment." I looked at Donovan, resting my chin on my hand. "I would love to see you try." My total lack of ear infuriated him even more. He tapped the screen of his phone, dialing the highly restricted, heavily guarded personal number of the most powerful CEO in the city. To prove his absolute authority to his screaming wife, Donovan placed the phone flat on the dining table and hit the speaker button. The phone rang loudly through the tense silence of the VIP room. It rang once, it rang twice. Then the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. A tall, incredibly imposing figure stepped out of the dimly lit corridor and into the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding an immediate, suffocating level of authority that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. He looked at the phone sitting on the table, then locked his piercing gray eyes directly onto Donovan. A deep, resonant voice echoed from right behind their table. "Why is my CFO calling me during my wife's family dinner?" The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open with a forceful thud. A tall, incredibly imposing figure stepped out of the dimly lit corridor and into the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers. Alexander Prescott wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his presence commanding an immediate, suffocating level of authority that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. He was not alone. 4 men in identical dark suits stepped in right behind him, their posture rigid and alert. They immediately moved to secure the exits, crossing their hands in front of them, turning the VIP room into a locked vault. Donovan was still holding his empty hand in the air, his fingers curled around the ghost of the phone he had just dropped. When he saw the face of the billionaire chief executive officer, he had just tried to call, all the blood drained completely from his face. His hands began to shake violently. He fell back into his chair, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto a landmine. Alexander did not even glance at the terrified executive sitting across the table. He walked straight past my father, whose mouth was hanging open in stunned silence. He walked past my mother, who was clutching her pearl necklace as if she were having a heart attack. He walked right up to my chair. He leaned down, placing a warm hand on my shoulder, and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. "Are you all right, my love?" he asked, his voice entirely different from the cold tone he had used just a moment ago. "I told you I would be waiting in the car, but it sounded like things were getting a little out of hand in here." I smiled and leaned into his touch. "I was handling it, Alexander. But they were just starting to threaten me with your legal department." Alexander straightened up. His piercing gray eyes swept over the table, taking in the pathetic, terrified faces of the people who shared my bloodline. He looked at the ruined property deed, the bank statements, and the bankruptcy filings scattered across the white linen. His lip curled in absolute disgust. "Caroline," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. "Why are you wasting your Christmas evening dealing with this trash?" The word echoed off the walls. Trash. The family that prided itself on country club memberships, luxury cars, and fake socialite status had just been reduced to garbage by the most powerful man in the city. Ashley stared at me, her eyes wide with a manic, shattered kind of horror. The reality was finally sinking into her incredibly dense brain. The sister she had mocked for being single and unemployed was the queen of the corporate empire she worshipped. I was the wife of the billionaire titan. Her husband bowed down to every single day. Her entire worldview, built on the illusion that she was superior to me, was disintegrating right in front of her eyes. Richard looked physically ill. The man who had threatened to destroy me just 10 minutes ago was now slumped in his seat, realizing that the daughter he threw away held the keys to his financial survival, and her husband held the power to crush him into dust. But Catherine, my mother, was a different breed of narcissist. When faced with absolute defeat, she defaulted to the only survival tactic she knew: manipulation. Catherine frantically smoothed down her silk blouse and forced a bright, sickeningly sweet smile onto her face. She pushed her chair back and stood up, extending her hands toward Alexander, as if she were welcoming an old dear friend into her home. "Alexander," Catherine gasped, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Oh my goodness. We had absolutely no idea. Caroline is so secretive, always keeping things to herself. If we had known our son-in-law was the Alexander Prescott, we would have arranged a proper introduction years ago. Please sit down. Have a glass of wine with us. We are just having a passionate family discussion. You know how families can be during the holidays. We are simply thrilled to officially welcome you to the family." Alexander did not take her hand. He did not smile back. He looked at my mother with a level of contempt so cold it could have frozen the wine in her glass. "Do not ever refer to me as your son-in-law." Alexander said, his voice slicing through her fake hospitality like a razor blade. "You lost the right to call Caroline your family the night you threw her out into a blizzard to cover up a felony. You are not my family. You are a liability." Catherine choked on her breath, her outstretched hands falling limply to her sides. She sank back down into her chair, utterly humiliated. Alexander turned his lethal attention away from my mother and focused entirely on the man sweating profusely at the other end of the table. Donovan tried to shrink into the upholstery, his eyes darting frantically toward the security guards blocking the door. "You have a lot of nerve invoking my name to threaten my wife." "Hayes," Alexander said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the chief financial officer. "You bragged about your direct line to me. You bragged about the power you wield at my company, so let us talk about your work performance." Alexander reached inside his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick-bound document stamped with the red seal of the Prescott Industries Internal Audit Division. He raised his arm and threw the heavy report directly across the table. It slammed into Donovan's chest before sliding down onto his lap. Donovan stared at the cover of the report, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. "That is a forensic audit," Alexander stated, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. "And we need to have a very serious conversation about exactly whose bank accounts you have been funding with my corporate capital." The heavy binder sat on Donovan's lap like a live grenade. The thick red wax seal of the Prescott Industries Internal Audit Division seemed to glow against the dark wool of his expensive charcoal trousers. I watched from my seat, comfortably sipping the last of my wine, as my brother-in-law completely forgot how to breathe. His hands hovered over the thick report, trembling so violently that his custom silver cufflinks rattled sharply against the edge of the mahogany table. Alexander did not move a single inch. He stood perfectly still, towering over Donovan, radiating the cold, calculated menace that had made him the most feared real estate and tech executive in Manhattan. "Open it," Alexander commanded. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the dead silence of the VIP room with absolute terrifying authority. "Open the report, Hayes. Read aloud what my forensic accountants found hiding in the fourth quarter projections for your specific division." Donovan swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temples, shining under the crystal chandeliers. He did not touch the binder. "Sir," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine that stripped away every ounce of his arrogant corporate persona. "Mr. Prescott, there must be some kind of administrative misunderstanding. I am the Chief Financial Officer for the entire Eastern Seaboard subsidiary. I have full executive clearance to move capital for operational expenses. Whatever your security team thinks they found, it was just standard portfolio restructuring. I even received a massive performance bonus last quarter for my efficiency." "A performance bonus." Alexander repeated, testing the words as if they were foul and rotting on his tongue. "Is that what you told your wife? Is that how you explain the sudden influx of millions in cash that paid for your luxury cars, your customized Rolex watches, and your extravagant Hamptons vacations?" Ashley, who had been sitting frozen in a state of absolute shock since Alexander walked through the doors, suddenly found her voice. The sheer arrogance that had defined her entire existence flared up, completely blinding her to the massive danger suffocating the room. "Of course it was a bonus!" Ashley snapped, glaring at Alexander, despite the heavily armed security guards flanking him. "Donovan is a top-tier executive. He worked 80 hours a week last year to secure those funds. He earned that money to provide for our family and maintain our status. You cannot just march into a private dinner and accuse my husband of making financial mistakes when he is the only reason your subsidiary is highly profitable." Alexander slowly turned his dark gaze toward my sister. The look of pure, unadulterated disgust on his face made Ashley instantly shrink back into her leather chair. "Your husband did not earn a single cent of that money," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a deadly razor-sharp whisper. "What your husband did was commit first-degree federal wire fraud." Catherine gasped loudly, clapping both hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. Richard sank further down into his seat, his face turning an unhealthy shade of pale gray. As a man whose own logistics company was bankrupt and riddled with bad debt, Richard recognized the terrifying reality of a federal financial crime. "Let me explain exactly how you earned your lavish lifestyle." Hayes Alexander continued, turning his lethal attention back to Donovan. "My elite auditors spent the last 72 hours tracing a massive, deliberate discrepancy in the commercial real estate acquisition fund you manage. We watched how you bypassed the dual authentication security protocols. We tracked how you authorized 7 distinct wire transfers over the past 9 months, funneling exactly $2.4 million of my corporate capital into a complex web of untraceable dummy corporations." Donovan looked like he was going to be physically sick. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles stark white, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. "Sir, please," he begged, all his previous boastful bravado completely destroyed. "I can fix it. I can transfer the funds back by Monday morning. Just give me 48 hours. I swear to you on my life I will make the corporate accounts whole. I have a family to protect. Do not ruin my entire life over a temporary lapse in judgment." "A lapse in judgment," I chimed in, leaning forward and resting my chin on my hands. "You stole nearly $2.5 million to fund your country club memberships and buy designer handbags, Donovan. You literally just spent the last hour mocking me for living in a supposedly cheap apartment while you were financing your entire arrogant existence with money you stole directly from my husband." Richard suddenly slammed his hands on the table, pointing a shaking, furious finger at Donovan. "You absolute idiot!" Richard shouted, his face contorted with intense panic. "You told me your wealth was legitimate. You told me you could help bail out my logistics company with your corporate bonuses. You are nothing but a common thief. You have dragged my innocent daughter into your criminal mess. Ashley burst into dramatic tears, playing the victim exactly as she had been trained to do her entire life. Daddy is right, she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I had no idea, I swear. Donovan told me his offshore investments were paying off. He lied to me. He used me to hide his crimes. I am a victim of his financial abuse. You have to believe me, Caroline. You have to tell your husband I had absolutely nothing to do with this stolen money. I looked at my sister, watching her desperately throw the man she had just fiercely defended straight under the proverbial bus. It was pathetic, but entirely predictable for the golden child who refused to ever take accountability. Alexander reached down and flipped the heavy audit report open. He bypassed the first dozen pages of dense financial data and stopped at a brightly highlighted section near the back. He tapped a manicured finger against a long series of international bank routing numbers. It is absolutely fascinating that you claim to be an innocent victim, Ashley. Alexander said, his tone completely devoid of any sympathy. Because the dummy corporations were just a temporary smokescreen. My security team traced the final destination of the stolen funds this afternoon. Every single fraudulent wire transfer was routed through the Cayman Islands and deposited directly into a highly secure offshore account with a single verified signatory. Donovan looked up quickly, a flash of deep confusion briefly cutting through his absolute terror. An offshore account, Donovan asked, his voice shaking uncontrollably. But I routed that money into a joint holding fund. I set it up for both of us to access for our real estate purchases. Alexander smiled, a sharp, ruthless expression that chilled the entire room. No, Donovan, you did not. The offshore account currently holding my $2.4 million is registered entirely and exclusively under the name Ashley Moore. The room went dead silent. Donovan slowly turned his head to look at his wife. The horrifying realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The massive fortune he had risked his entire career and his freedom to steal was not sitting in a joint corporate account. He had zero legal access to it. His beloved perfect wife had manipulated him into committing federal wire fraud, and she had secretly ensured she was the only one holding the purse strings to the stolen millions. Donovan stared at Ashley in pure, unadulterated shock. Donovan stared at his wife as the reality of Alexander Prescott's statement settled heavily over the room. The absolute silence in the private dining area was thick, suffocating, and entirely focused on the rapidly deteriorating executive. Donovan was a brilliant financial analyst. He built his entire career on understanding corporate structures, identifying liabilities, and calculating risk. Now his sharp mind was rapidly calculating the horrifying legal math of his own life. Wire fraud across international borders carried a federal prison sentence of up to 20 years. He had bypassed Prescott Industries' dual authentication security protocols. He had authorized the transfers. His digital fingerprints were permanently burned into the company mainframes. He had committed the crime, taken the absolute maximum level of legal risk, all under the belief that the money was sitting safely in a joint offshore trust he could access to flee the country if things went south. But Ashley held the only key. She was the sole signatory. If the federal authorities arrested him tonight, he would go to a maximum security prison with absolutely zero leverage, and his wife would walk away with $2.4 million. He slowly stood up. His heavy wooden chair scraped harshly against the floor, eventually tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the expensive carpet. Donovan did not even blink at the noise. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and locked entirely on the woman sitting across from him. Ashley pressed her back firmly against her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the armrests. She tried to maintain her innocent, victimized facade, but her voice betrayed her rising panic. Donovan, she stammered, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and Alexander's massive security guards. Donovan, you have to believe me. I do not know what he is talking about. The bank must have made an administrative error. I would never open a private account without you. An administrative error, Donovan repeated. His voice started as a low, dangerous growl, barely a whisper, but it quickly began to escalate in volume and intensity. You sat right next to me in our home office when I initiated the final transfer. You were the one who handed me the routing numbers. You told me the offshore broker was a close contact from your country club days. You set up the entire corporate shell structure. Ashley shook her head frantically, her blonde hair falling out of its perfect style. Shut up, Donovan. You do not know what you are saying. You are just panicking because you got caught. Do not try to drag me into your pathetic mistakes. Donovan let out a harsh, broken laugh that sounded like tearing metal. My mistakes, he shouted, taking a heavy step toward her. I never wanted to touch that money. You cried in our kitchen for weeks. You screamed at me every single night, telling me I was a failure of a provider because I could not afford to buy you the $3 million summer home your friends were buying in the Hamptons. You told me that if I truly loved you, I would secure our financial freedom. You manipulated me into robbing my own employer so you could maintain your fake, arrogant lifestyle. Catherine raised a trembling hand, trying to intervene. Donovan, please lower your voice. People outside will hear you. You are acting completely irrational. I am acting irrational, Donovan roared, turning his fierce gaze toward my mother. You raised a parasite, Catherine. You raised a manipulative, greedy parasite who cares about absolutely no one but herself. She did not just set me up to take the fall for a federal felony. She has been planning to leave me the exact second the final wire transfer cleared. Ashley stood up quickly, her face flushed with sudden, undeniable terror. Donovan, stop talking right now. But Donovan was past the point of return. His corporate career was dead. His freedom was gone. He had absolutely nothing left to lose, and he was determined to drag his treacherous wife down into the flames with him. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. He ripped the top open with aggressive force and slammed his hand down on the table, sending a dozen glossy, high-definition photographs sliding across the white linen. They mixed with the spilled wine, the ruined property deed, and the federal bankruptcy filings, creating a chaotic display of total family destruction. You thought I was stupid? Ashley Donovan spat, pointing at the photographs scattered in front of her parents. You thought I was just a blind walking ATM. I am a financial analyst. I notice when credit card bills do not match your schedule. I notice when you withdraw massive amounts of cash from our checking accounts. I hired a private investigator a month ago to find out exactly where my money was going. Richard looked down at the table. His eyes widened in absolute sickening horror. Catherine covered her mouth to muffle a sharp, agonizing gasp. The photographs were irrefutable. They showed Ashley in various luxury resorts, expensive restaurants, and private hotel balconies. But she was not alone. In every single picture, she was intimately entangled with a heavily muscled, much younger man. They were kissing, holding hands, and carrying shopping bags from designer boutiques. Meet Trent Donovan, announced, his voice dripping with pure, concentrated venom. Her 25-year-old personal trainer. Ashley stared at the photographs, her jaw dropping open. The color completely drained from her face as her perfect, faithful wife persona was utterly annihilated in front of her parents, her sister, and the most powerful CEO in Manhattan. She has been sleeping with him for 8 months. Donovan continued, turning to look directly at Richard. Your perfect golden daughter took the money I earned and the money she manipulated me into stealing, and she used it to buy her boy toy, a leased sports car, and a high-end condo downtown. She set me up to take the fall for federal wire fraud, so she could drain the offshore account and run off to the Cayman Islands with a man 10 years younger than her. Catherine looked at Ashley, her eyes filled with a mixture of profound disgust and total disbelief. Ashley, is this true? Catherine asked, her voice cracking under the weight of the undeniable evidence. You are having an affair. You stole millions of dollars to fund an affair. Ashley realized she was completely cornered. There was no lie she could spin, no manipulation she could use to escape the photographs staring back at her. Her facade broke, entirely replaced by the raw, vicious, animalistic rage of a narcissist exposed. She lunged across the dining table, knocking over a crystal water glass, and swung her arm with all her strength. She slapped Donovan directly across the face. The sharp, explosive crack of her hand connecting with his jaw echoed loudly in the room. You pathetic, useless loser! Ashley screamed, her face contorted in absolute fury. You were never enough for me. You were supposed to be my ticket to the elite circles, but you were just a mid-level suit. I deserve to be rich. I deserve to have whatever I want. Donovan touched his cheek, his eyes burning with intense hatred. You deserve a federal prison cell, he fired back, and that is exactly where you are going. Richard stood frozen at the head of the table watching the horrific scene unfold. The logistics company he built was bankrupt. His massive Greenwich estate was officially foreclosed and owned by the daughter he had abused and discarded. His son-in-law was a confessed corporate thief headed for a federal penitentiary. And his beloved golden child, the daughter he had protected at all costs, was exposed as a manipulative, adulterous criminal who was undoubtedly going down as a co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar wire fraud case. The immense crushing weight of his entirely ruined legacy finally hit him. Richard's breathing suddenly became incredibly shallow and rapid. He reached up with a trembling hand, clutching tightly at the center of his chest. His face turned a terrifying, unhealthy shade of purple. He let out a strained, agonizing gasp as his knees buckled beneath him. He pitched forward, knocking over a heavy wine bottle, and crashed violently onto the floor of the VIP room. Catherine pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. She looked past me to the 6 New York City police officers who had just marched through the heavy oak doors of the VIP dining room. "Arrest them," my mother cried out, her voice pitching into a hysterical, theatrical shriek. "My estranged daughter and this man broke into our private family dinner. They are extorting us. They are threatening my husband. Look at him, he is having a massive heart attack on the floor. Get an ambulance and put these two in handcuffs right now." Richard was still sprawled awkwardly on the expensive imported carpet. He clutched his chest with both hands, taking loud, exaggerated, wheezing gasps of air. It was a highly practiced, pathetic performance. He kept one eye squeezed shut, while the other darted frantically around the room, waiting for the police to forcefully remove Alexander and me from the restaurant so he could safely escape his financial ruin. The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark trench coat with a gold shield clipped to his belt, stepped fully into the room. He did not rush to Richard's side. He did not look at me. He did not look at Alexander. He certainly did not reach for his handcuffs to arrest the billionaire chief executive officer standing quietly by my chair. Instead, the detective gave a brief, highly respectful nod to Alexander's armed security detail. The private guard smoothly stepped aside, granting the police full access to the room. The detective walked right past my mother's outstretched pointing finger. He walked right past my table setting. He stopped directly in front of the spot where my father was dramatically rolling on the floor. "Get up," Richard, the detective ordered. His voice was completely devoid of any sympathy or urgency. "The paramedics already reviewed your vitals in the lobby while we were securing the building perimeter. We know your heart is functioning perfectly. You are not having a medical emergency. Get on your feet right now." The sheer freezing authority in the detective's voice instantly cured my father's imaginary heart condition. Richard's exaggerated wheezing stopped abruptly, his face flushed with profound, undeniable embarrassment. He awkwardly scrambled to his feet, brushing the dust off his wrinkled suit jacket, desperately trying to reclaim a tiny shred of his shattered dignity. Catherine rushed to his side, grabbing his arm tightly. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, glaring at the detective. "Do you have any idea who we are? My husband is the head of a massive logistics corporation. We are elite members of this community. I demand you arrest the people harassing us immediately." The detective ignored her entitled outrage. He reached inside his coat pocket and pulled out 2 folded legal documents bearing the official stamp of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. "Catherine Moore and Richard Moore," the detective announced, his voice carrying the heavy, inescapable weight of the law. "You are both under arrest. The charges are first-degree real estate fraud, aggravated identity theft, and federal bank fraud." The entire room went completely dead. Ashley, who had been sitting frozen in her chair since Donovan exposed her affair, let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Donovan slowly backed away from the table, pressing himself flat against the soundproof wall. He knew exactly what was happening. He knew that if the local police were arresting his in-laws for bank fraud, the federal agents were inevitably coming for him next. "This is an absolute outrage," Richard roared, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I am a wealthy businessman. I have not committed any fraud. There has been a massive administrative mistake. You cannot just march into a private establishment and arrest us on bogus charges. I will call the mayor. I will sue this entire city department. I picked up my wine glass and took a slow, calm sip. There is no mistake, Richard, I said, keeping my gaze locked on his terrified face. Federal financial crimes move incredibly fast. When a billionaire's corporate legal team hands a perfectly packaged, irrefutable evidentiary file directly to the district attorney. Catherine whipped her head toward me, her eyes wide with absolute horror. You, she whispered, her voice shaking violently. You gave them the files. I set my glass down on the table. Yesterday morning, my legal team submitted the surveillance footage from First National Bank. I explained clearly. We provided the forensic signature analysis proving you both forged my name on the home equity line of credit documents. We submitted the digital routing numbers showing exactly how you funneled that stolen $50,000 directly to Ashley's wedding vendors. The district attorney did not need to launch a lengthy investigation. You handed them a fully documented open and shut felony case on a silver platter. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, the detective instructed, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Richard tried to step backward, but two uniformed officers instantly grabbed his arms, twisting them firmly behind him. The cold, sharp click of the metal cuffs locking around his wrists echoed loudly in the room. The sound shattered the grand illusion of the Moore family dynasty forever. The arrogant, controlling patriarch was officially a criminal in custody. "Do not touch me!" Catherine shrieked, backing away as a female officer approached her. "I am a respectable woman. I am a high society socialite. You are making a terrible mistake. Ashley, do something. Call our lawyers." Ashley did not move a single muscle. The golden child just sat in her chair, staring blankly at her parents, absolutely useless, now that the endless flow of stolen money had finally dried up. The female officer grabbed Catherine's wrists, ignoring her frantic, pathetic struggling, and locked the handcuffs securely in place. The physical reality of the cold steel, binding her wrists, completely broke my mother. The haughty, cruel woman who had spent 35 years making me feel completely worthless suddenly realized she possessed zero power. Her social status was gone. Her wealth was fake. Her freedom was officially over. Catherine's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the expensive restaurant carpet, sobbing hysterically. The sheer crushing humiliation of being arrested in front of her wealthy son-in-law and the restaurant staff stripped away every ounce of her pride. She shuffled across the floor on her knees, the heavy handcuffs restricting her movements. She crawled directly to where I was sitting. She reached out with her bound hands and frantically grabbed the hem of my designer dress, her tears staining her expensive silk blouse. "Caroline, please!" Catherine wailed, her voice breaking into a desperate, agonizing beg. "Caroline, I am so sorry. We were just desperate to pay for the wedding. We never meant to hurt you. Please, you have to tell the police it was a misunderstanding. You have to drop these charges. You have all the money in the world now. You do not need to do this to us. Please, Caroline, we are your parents. You cannot send us to prison. We are family." I looked down at the woman weeping on the expensive imported carpet. Catherine's perfectly styled hair was now clinging to her wet cheeks. Her heavy diamond earrings swung erratically as she sobbed, begging for a level of mercy she had never once shown me. She clutched the fabric of my designer dress with her handcuffed wrists, looking up at me with wide, desperate eyes. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. The midnight blue silk of my dress slipped right out of her grasping fingers. "Family," I repeated. My voice dropped to a harsh, freezing whisper that carried clearly across the quiet room. "You are kneeling on the floor in steel handcuffs facing federal prison for identity theft, and you finally decide to use the word family." Catherine scrambled forward on her knees, completely ignoring the sharp tug of the metal chains binding her wrists. "Caroline, please," she gasped, struggling to breathe through her rising panic. "I am your mother. You know I love you. We just made a terrible mistake. We were under so much financial pressure to maintain our image. You have a billionaire husband. You own private equity firms. You do not need to destroy our lives over $50,000. Tell the detectives to let us go." The lead detective stood completely still, watching the exchange. He did not intervene. Alexander remained firmly by my side, his presence a towering wall of protection, allowing me to handle my own battles exactly as I saw fit. I looked at Richard, who was currently being held firmly by two uniformed officers. His face was turned away, too cowardly to watch his wife beg on his behalf. I looked at Ashley, who was frozen in her chair, completely useless now that her endless supply of stolen money had evaporated. I am not telling the police to drop anything, I said, looking back down at Catherine. But before they take you out of this restaurant and process you into a holding cell, I want an answer. I want the absolute truth, and I want it right now. Catherine stared up at me, her chest heaving. Anything. Just ask me. I will tell you anything. Why did you hate me so much? I demanded. The question hung in the room, heavy with 35 years of suppressed pain and sheer exhaustion. Why did you spend my entire life trying to break me? You bought Ashley luxury cars. You funded her extravagant, arrogant lifestyle. But you threw me out into a freezing blizzard 5 years ago. You framed me for a corporate crime she committed. You stole my home equity. Why was I the specific target of your endless, vicious cruelty? Catherine swallowed hard. She looked away, her eyes darting toward Richard, then toward the floor. I did not hate you, she stammered, falling instinctively back into her habitual lies. I was just strict. I wanted to push you to be successful. I pulled my phone from my handbag. I tapped the screen and opened the voice recording application. I hit the bright red record button and held the device out toward her. Do not lie to me, I warned her, my voice rising with sharp, undeniable authority. You are going to a federal holding cell tonight. Your fake high society life is entirely over. You have absolutely nothing left to protect. So tell me the truth. Why did you need to destroy me? The sheer force of my demand, combined with the crushing reality of the police officers waiting to haul her away, finally shattered the last remaining wall of Catherine's fragile ego. The desperate begging mother act completely evaporated. Her face twisted into a mask of raw, ugly resentment. Because you did not need me, Catherine screamed. Her voice was shrill, echoing violently off the soundproof walls of the VIP room. You never needed me. From the day you were a teenager, you were completely self-sufficient. You got your own academic scholarships. You got your own apartments. You looked at me with those cold, judgmental eyes, just like Richard's successful first wife used to look at me. The room went completely silent. Richard squeezed his eyes shut, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. You were exactly like her. Catherine spat the tears of panic turning into tears of pure, unadulterated venom. You had her independence. You had her arrogant drive. You made me feel entirely inadequate in my own home. You made me feel like I was nothing but a useless trophy wife who only knew how to spend money. Catherine shifted on her knees, pointing her handcuffed hands toward the golden child sitting frozen at the table. But Ashley, Catherine cried out. Ashley needed me for everything. She needed my money. She needed my social connections to find a husband. She needed my constant approval just to function in the real world. She made me feel powerful. She made me feel like the absolute center of the universe. Catherine was breathing heavily, her face flushed red as years of toxic suppressed jealousy finally spilled out into the open. I wanted to break you, Catherine confessed, her voice dropping into a vicious, shaking growl. I wanted to crush that independent spirit out of you. I wanted to ruin your career and steal your assets, so you would be forced to crawl back to my house. I wanted you to beg for my financial help, so I could finally hold all the power over you. But you never begged. You just walked away and built an empire. I stared down at the woman on the floor. For 3.5 decades, I had wondered what was fundamentally wrong with me. I had wondered why I was so unlovable, why I was always the designated scapegoat, why nothing I did was ever good enough to earn her basic maternal affection. Hearing the ugly, pathetic truth did not hurt me. It set me completely free. She did not hate me because I was a failure. She hated me because I was a massive threat to her profound narcissistic insecurity. I nodded slowly. I tapped the screen of my phone, stopping the recording, and saved the audio file securely to my encrypted cloud drive. Thank you for the clarity, Catherine, I said softly. My voice was entirely devoid of anger. I felt absolutely nothing for her anymore. I reached into my designer bag for the very last time. I pulled out a single sheet of stark white paper bearing the bold red seal of Vanguard Capital's legal division. I dropped the paper directly onto the carpet, letting it flutter down until it landed right on top of Catherine's handcuffed wrists. "What is this?" Catherine choked out, staring down at the legal document. "That is an expedited eviction notice," I replied. "As the new legal owner of your foreclosed Greenwich estate, I am exercising my right to secure the property. You and Richard have exactly 1 hour to arrange for someone to clear your personal clothing out of the mansion. At midnight, my private security team is locking down the front gates. Anything left inside will be permanently incinerated." The crisp white paper of the eviction notice rested on Catherine's handcuffed wrists. The reality of the document radiated through the room. The Greenwich estate was gone. Ashley sat completely paralyzed at the dining table. The golden child was doing the brutal, unforgiving math of her own existence. Her luxury condo downtown was purchased with stolen corporate funds. The federal government would seize it by morning. Her bank accounts were tied to Donovan's fraudulent wire transfers. The authorities would freeze every single asset she had. Now the sprawling family mansion in Connecticut, her ultimate safety net, was legally owned by the sister she had mocked just an hour ago. Ashley had absolutely nothing. She pushed her chair back violently. She ignored her father, who was still in the custody of two uniformed officers. She ignored the lead detective. She marched directly over to where her mother was kneeling on the floor. "Give me the keys to the Mercedes," Ashley demanded. Her voice was shrill and frantic. "Give me the keys right now, Mom. I need to leave the city. I need cash. I need to get out of here before the federal agents show up." Catherine looked up at her favorite daughter with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I do not have the keys, Ashley. The police confiscated my purse when they arrested me. Besides, the cars are leased through your father's company. Caroline just said the company is bankrupt. They will repossess the vehicles immediately." Ashley let out a harsh, desperate scream. "You are useless. You told me we were protected. You told me we had millions in the corporate accounts. You lied to me. I am going to prison because of your stupid financial advice. I need money to hire a defense attorney." Ashley's manic eyes darted wildly around the room. She was looking for anything of value, anything she could grab and pawn before the police hauled her away. Her gaze locked onto the heavy, glittering piece of jewelry resting against Catherine's silk blouse. It was a custom diamond and platinum necklace. Richard had purchased it for Catherine's 50th birthday, boasting to the entire country club that it cost $100,000. "Give me the necklace," Ashley ordered, dropping to her knees, right next to her handcuffed mother. She reached out with her trembling hands, her manicured fingers diving straight for the diamonds. Catherine jerked her head back, her face twisting in pure panic. "No. Get your hands off me, Ashley. This necklace is the only asset I have left. I need to sell it to hire a criminal defense lawyer. You are not taking my jewelry." "You do not need a lawyer!" Ashley shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the private dining room. "You are an old woman. You can survive a few years in a minimum security prison. I am 31 years old. I am beautiful. I cannot go to federal prison. Give me the necklace right now." Ashley lunged forward. She grabbed the thick platinum chain with both hands and yanked violently. Catherine screamed in pain as the heavy metal dug sharply into the back of her neck. Despite her hands being locked in steel cuffs behind her back, the older woman fought back with absolute ferocity. Catherine threw her body weight forward, ramming her shoulder directly into Ashley's chest. She knocked her golden child backward onto the expensive restaurant carpet. "You greedy, ungrateful little brat!" Catherine spat, kicking out with her designer heels. "I gave you everything. I ruined my relationship with my other daughter just to spoil you. You will not steal my only lifeline." Ashley scrambled right back up like a feral animal. She tackled her own mother to the floor. The perfect high society facade they had maintained for decades completely vanished. They were fighting like rabid dogs over a piece of jewelry. Ashley grabbed a fistful of Catherine's perfectly styled blonde hair and yanked her head back, reaching desperately for the clasp of the diamond necklace. Catherine shrieked and kicked wildly, her expensive silk blouse tearing at the seam. The sound of tearing fabric and hysterical screaming filled the VIP room. The crystal wine glasses on the table rattled from the physical impact of their bodies slamming against the heavy wooden table legs. Richard watched his wife and daughter tearing each other apart, his face buried in his hands, completely unable to stop the destruction of his family. I stood completely still next to Alexander, watching the ultimate destruction of the perfect family. This was the bond they had always bragged about. This was the unconditional love they claimed I was too flawed to receive. The absolute second the money ran out, they turned on each other with homicidal rage. "Break it up," the lead detective shouted. Two sturdy New York police officers rushed forward. They grabbed Ashley by her shoulders and physically dragged her off her mother. Ashley fought them tooth and nail, kicking her legs and screaming obscenities at Catherine. She was completely unhinged, her makeup smeared down her face, her designer dress wrinkled and torn. "You ruined my life," Ashley screamed at her mother while the officers pinned her arms behind her back. "I hate you. I hate both of you. You are pathetic failures." Catherine lay on the floor, gasping for air, her necklace sitting crookedly against her bruised collarbone. She wept loudly, a pathetic broken sound that carried absolutely no dignity. While the entire police detail was completely distracted by the vicious mother-daughter brawl, Donovan saw his opening. The arrogant chief financial officer knew his time was up. He smoothed his hands over his tailored suit, his dark features tight with calculating desperation. He knew the federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division were undoubtedly waiting outside the building. He had to get out of the restaurant before Alexander Prescott officially handed over the audit reports. He would disappear into the city, leverage his remaining hidden cash, and vanish. Donovan quietly stepped backward. He moved away from the dining table, slipping into the shadows near the back of the VIP room. There was a secondary service door used exclusively by the waitstaff, leading directly into the busy restaurant kitchens and out to the service alleyway. It was his only chance at freedom. He moved with silent, desperate speed. He reached the heavy oak service door. He wrapped his sweating hand around the brass handle. He turned the knob slowly, minimizing any noise. He pushed the door open just a few inches. He could hear the chaotic sounds of the kitchen staff preparing meals. The cool draft from the service hallway hit his face. He felt a sudden massive surge of relief. He was going to escape. Donovan pushed the door wider and stepped forward. A massive, heavily muscled hand suddenly reached out from the darkness of the service hallway. The hand slammed flat against the solid oak door with bone-shattering force. The heavy door swung violently backward. It slammed completely shut right in Donovan's face with a deafening crack. Donovan stumbled backward, his heart hammering against his ribs in absolute terror. Two of Alexander Prescott's elite private security guards stepped out from the shadows of the room. They had been watching the back exit the entire time. They crossed their arms over their broad chests, completely blocking his only path to freedom. The heavy oak service door rattled violently in its frame as the two massive security guards shoved Donovan backward into the VIP dining room. He stumbled, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the dark wine that had soaked into the imported carpet. He crashed hard against the edge of the dining table, knocking over a silver candlestick that clattered loudly across the room. He scrambled to regain his balance, his eyes wide and frantic as he looked at the two men blocking his only exit. They were built like brick walls, standing shoulder to shoulder with their arms crossed, their expressions entirely devoid of mercy. Donovan slowly turned around. The private dining room was a complete disaster zone. Ashley and Catherine were still pinned to the floor by the police officers, completely exhausted from their vicious physical fight over the diamond necklace. Richard was being held firmly against a chair by two uniformed officers, his wrists bound tightly in steel handcuffs. The flashing blue and red lights from the police cruisers outside painted eerie shadows across the walls. The federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division were undoubtedly marching through the main restaurant lobby right at this very second. Howe was entirely out of options. His corporate arrogance, his boastful pride, and his manipulative cruelty completely evaporated. Donovan looked at Alexander Prescott. The billionaire chief executive officer stood calmly next to my chair, adjusting his immaculate suit cuffs, watching the destruction of my family, as if he were attending a mildly entertaining theatrical performance. The terrifying reality of Alexander's absolute power finally broke the corrupt executive. Donovan collapsed. He dropped straight down onto both knees, right there in the middle of the restaurant. The sharp impact of his knees hitting the hardwood floor echoed loudly. He ignored his custom-tailored trousers soaking up the spilled wine. He held his shaking hands up in a desperate, pathetic gesture of surrender. Sir Donovan gasped, struggling to pull enough air into his lungs. "Mr. Prescott, please. You have to listen to me. You are a businessman. You understand leverage. I can offer you a deal, a massive deal." Alexander raised a single dark eyebrow. He did not take a single step toward the kneeling executive. "A deal." Alexander echoed, his voice vibrating with dangerous, freezing amusement. "You stole $2.4 million from my corporate acquisitions fund, attempted to flee my security detail through a kitchen service alley, and now you want to negotiate a plea bargain with me while you are trapped in a locked room. You are in no position to offer me anything, Hayes." "I have the logistics company files," Donovan shouted, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my father. "Your wife bought his corporate debt, but she does not know the full extent of the rot hiding inside his empire. The bankruptcy was not just a result of poor management, it was intentional. Richard has been hiding major assets from the federal government for over a decade." Richard jerked his head up, his eyes widening in sheer terror. "Shut your mouth, Donovan!" Richard roared, straining violently against the grip of the two police officers holding his arms. "Do not say another word. You are violating attorney-client privilege. You are violating our non-disclosure agreements. I will ruin you." "I am not a lawyer." Donovan fired back, completely throwing his father-in-law to the wolves to save his own skin. "And those non-disclosure agreements are completely void when it comes to federal tax evasion. Mr. Prescott, you have to listen to me. Before Vanguard Capital bought his debt, Richard paid me under the table to cook his corporate books. He has a massive network of illegal shell companies hiding in Delaware. He committed massive tax fraud, defrauding the IRS out of millions just to fund Catherine's country club lifestyle and buy Ashley her luxury cars." Catherine let out a horrified gasp from the floor, realizing her husband had been committing federal tax crimes to maintain her socialite status. "I know exactly where the hidden ledgers are," Donovan pleaded, crawling a few inches forward on his knees, his hands clasped together in desperate prayer. "I know the encryption codes to his private servers. I know the names of the corrupt bank managers who facilitated the offshore transfers. If you let the federal agents arrest me tonight, that information gets buried in a decade-long court battle. Your wife's equity firm will be tied up in endless federal litigation trying to secure the collateral you are owed. The government will freeze everything." Donovan was sweating profusely, his chest heaving under his ruined silk tie. "But if you let me walk out that back door right now," Donovan begged, tears of pure terror welling in his eyes. "If you call off your security guards and give me a 24-hour head start before you hand over the audit reports to the authorities, I will give you complete unrestricted access to Richard's hidden network. I will turn state's witness against him. I will hand you the keys to completely dismantle his entire life, without your legal team having to lift a single finger. Just let me go. I have a family, please." I looked down at Donovan. The man who had spent the entire evening mocking my clothes, my apartment, and my supposed single status was now kneeling in spilled wine, begging my husband to let him run away from his own crimes by selling out my father. It was the ultimate display of cowardice. I glanced up at Alexander. My husband caught my eye, a brief, silent communication passing between us. He understood exactly what I wanted. Alexander slowly reached into his tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out a phone to call off the security guards. He pulled out a sleek silver data drive. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, letting the brilliant light of the crystal chandelier catch the metallic surface. Donovan stared at the drive, his mouth hanging slightly open with desperate hope, genuinely believing he had just successfully negotiated his freedom. Alexander smiled. It was a ruthless, terrifying expression that completely shattered the final remnants of Donovan's hope. "You severely underestimate my wife, Hayes," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a freezing, lethal register. "You think Caroline bought a $10 million toxic debt portfolio without doing her own due diligence. You think she did not already know exactly how corrupt this entire family truly is." I leaned forward in my chair, looking directly into Donovan's panicked eyes. When Richard defaulted on his loan 3 months ago, I initiated an aggressive asset seizure, I explained calmly. I did not just foreclose on the Connecticut mansion. I foreclosed on the off-site commercial storage facility, where Richard thought he was safely hiding his digital infrastructure. Alexander tossed the silver data drive. It clattered harshly against the hardwood floor, rolling to a stop, right next to Donovan's trembling knees. I do not need your testimony, Alexander stated coldly. My wife's firm already bought your servers. The silver data drive sat on the polished hardwood floor, gleaming brightly under the crystal chandeliers. Richard stared at the tiny device, as if it were a loaded weapon about to detonate. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was completely gone. His heavy shoulders slumped forward, pulling painfully against the tight grip of the steel handcuffs locking his wrists firmly behind his back. The two uniformed police officers holding him stood perfectly still, letting the sheer suffocating weight of Alexander's revelation crush the last remaining fragments of Richard's pride. Donovan stayed on his knees, weeping silently into his hands, as two federal agents in dark windbreakers finally stepped into the VIP dining room. They grabbed the ruined chief financial officer by his arms and hauled him roughly to his feet. Donovan did not even try to fight them. He just kept sobbing as the agents marched him toward the exit, his corporate career and his freedom entirely destroyed. Richard watched his son-in-law get dragged away, his eyes wide and panicked. He slowly lifted his head, his face a sickly pale gray, sweating profusely under the bright restaurant lights. He looked past Alexander. He looked past the federal agents. Richard locked his desperate, terrified eyes entirely on me. Caroline, Richard croaked, his voice cracking violently. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his panic-stricken lungs. Caroline, please listen to me. You have to stop this. You have to call off your legal team right now. I am a 62-year-old man. My heart cannot take the physical stress of a federal investigation. If they drag me into a courtroom for tax evasion and massive corporate fraud, I will not survive the trial. I will die in a prison cell. I remained standing perfectly still, resting my hands calmly by my sides. I watched the man who had terrorized me for 3 decades beg for his life. I felt absolutely no pity. You should have thought about your health before you set up a dozen illegal shell companies in Delaware to fund Catherine's elite country club memberships, I replied coldly. You should have thought about federal prison before you walked into a bank branch and forged my signature to steal $50,000 in home equity. You committed the crimes, Richard. Now you get to experience the consequences. Richard shook his head frantically, straining against the heavy grip of the police officers holding his arms. No, Caroline. No. You cannot do this to me. I am your father. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head. I paid for your education. You owe me a basic level of respect. You cannot just stand by and watch your own flesh and blood be hauled away in handcuffs. We are family. The sheer audacity of his plea echoed loudly across the private dining room. Ashley, who was still pinned to the carpet by the police, let out a pathetic broken whimper. Catherine was sobbing hysterically in the corner, her expensive silk blouse ruined. But Richard kept his eyes entirely on me, genuinely believing that the age-old guilt trip of parental authority would somehow magically override a mountain of federal indictments. I smoothed down the midnight blue silk fabric of my dress, taking my time, letting the dead silence stretch out and suffocate him. I walked slowly around the edge of the long dining table until I was standing directly in front of him. Alexander stepped slightly to the side, maintaining a highly intimidating physical presence, but allowing me full access to the man who had tried to destroy me. You are not my father, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, stripping away every ounce of emotion. You lost the absolute right to use that title exactly 5 years ago. Richard flinched, trying to take a step backward, but the police officers held him firmly in place. Do you remember that night in December? I asked, my voice dropping to a freezing, razor-sharp whisper. I do. I remember every single agonizing detail. I brought you the internal audit reports. I showed you the exact routing numbers proving that Ashley had embezzled nearly $500,000 from the corporate accounts. I handed you the irrefutable truth that your golden child was a manipulative thief. And what did you do, Richard? He swallowed hard, looking down at his expensive scuffed leather shoes. I was trying to protect the company reputation, he mumbled defensively. You were protecting your own massive ego. I fired back, my voice echoing sharply off the walls. You knew she was guilty, but instead of holding her accountable, you decided I was the perfect scapegoat. You deleted my audit files from the servers. You terminated my employment. You gathered the entire extended family and told them I was a dangerous criminal. You completely blacklisted me from the financial industry. I leaned in closer, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. Then you threw me out of your house. I continued my words, hitting him like physical blows. It was 20 degrees outside. There was a freezing blizzard tearing through New York. I had no coat, no money, and nowhere to go because you illegally froze my bank accounts. You watched me stand in the snow, shivering and crying, begging you to just tell the truth. You stood on your heated porch, looked me dead in the eye, and told me I was a worthless disappointment. Then you slammed the heavy oak door right in my face and locked it. Richard was hyperventilating now. The memory of his supreme cruelty was staring him right in the face, backed by $1 billion of corporate power and a squad of armed police officers. I was just angry. Richard sobbed, tears of pure terror finally spilling down his cheeks. I made a terrible mistake, Caroline. I was a coward. I am so sorry. I am begging you on my knees. Please have mercy on me. I am an old man. I stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. I watched the mighty, arrogant patriarch reduced to an absolutely pathetic, sniveling shell of a human being. He did not regret what he did to me. He only regretted that I had survived the blizzard and returned as the executioner of his fake empire. I reached into my designer handbag. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper and a sleek black pen. I held the document up so Richard could clearly see the bold legal text printed across the page. I will give you exactly one choice, Richard. I stated, my voice ringing with terrifying authority. The district attorney has all the evidence of your bank fraud, your mortgage forgery, and your illegal shell companies. If you walk out of this restaurant and try to fight this in court, Vanguard Capital will fund the prosecution's expert witnesses. We will drag this out until you are sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. You will die behind bars. Richard let out a strangled, horrifying gasp. Or I continued tapping the heavy paper. You can take option 2. This is a complete, unredacted public confession. It details every single crime you committed, including framing me 5 years ago, forging my signature on the home equity line of credit, and orchestrating massive corporate tax evasion. I held the pen up right in front of his sweating face. If you sign this confession right here, right now, completely waiving your right to a trial, I will instruct my legal team to structure the financial crimes as a civil settlement. You will lose every single penny you have ever made. You will be entirely bankrupt. You will never work in this city again. But I will use my leverage with the district attorney to keep you out of a federal prison cell. Richard stared at the confession document. His chest heaved violently. He looked at the police officers gripping his arms. He looked at his crying wife on the floor. You are going to take everything from me, Richard whispered, his voice completely broken. I am taking exactly what you owe me, I replied coldly. Go to trial and face 20 years in a concrete cell, or sign a complete public confession right now, and I will reduce it to a civil settlement. Choose. Richard stared at the heavy white paper resting on the table. His entire body was shaking violently. He looked at the stark black ink, the damning legal terms outlining his complete and utter ruin. He looked at the 2 uniformed police officers standing on either side of him, their hands resting near their utility belts. He looked at Alexander, whose imposing presence offered absolutely no mercy. Finally, Richard looked down at his own trembling hands. I will sign it, Richard choked out. His voice was completely shattered, stripped of all its previous commanding authority. I will sign the confession. Just give me the pen. Please, Caroline. I will give you everything you want. Just keep me out of a federal prison cell. I did not hand him the pen. Not yet. A piece of paper filed away in a corporate legal vault was far too quiet for the level of destruction he had inflicted on my life. Richard and Catherine had spent the last 5 years building an elaborate, sparkling facade. They had paraded around high society, drinking expensive champagne at country club galas, telling all their wealthy friends that I was a disgraced, unstable criminal who had broken their hearts. I wanted that facade burned to the ground. I wanted the ashes scattered where everyone could see them. I reached into my bag and pulled out my personal phone. I unlocked the screen and opened the social media application. I navigated directly to the private, highly exclusive group page for the Greenwich Heritage Club. It was the premier country club in the state, a place where multimillionaires, real estate tycoons, and old money families gossiped, networked, and judged anyone who did not meet their impossible financial standards. Catherine was the vice president of their elite social committee. "What are you doing?" Catherine shrieked from the floor. She saw the familiar gold crest of the country club logo, glowing brightly on my screen. "Caroline, put that phone away right now. This is a private family legal matter. You cannot involve the club." "There is absolutely nothing private about this," I replied smoothly. I pressed the button to start a live video broadcast directly to the group feed. The red recording indicator lit up instantly on my screen. I held the phone up, pointing the camera lens directly at Richard's pale, sweating face. In the background of the frame, viewers could clearly see the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating the restaurant windows. They could see the two uniformed officers standing guard over him. The visual context was completely undeniable. "Read the confession," I ordered my father. "Read it out loud clearly so every single person in your elite social circle understands exactly who they have been playing golf with for the past 2 years." Richard stared at the camera lens in pure, unfiltered horror. The live viewer count in the top corner of the screen was already ticking upward rapidly as club members received the unexpected notification. 10 viewers, 50 viewers, 150 viewers. The alert was spreading like wildfire through the wealthy enclaves of Connecticut and Manhattan. "You cannot do this to me," Richard begged, his voice trembling so hard he could barely form the words. "You are publicly executing me. If I say this on camera, I will be banned from the club by tomorrow morning. My entire professional network will block my calls. I will be an absolute outcast in this city." "You are already an outcast," I stated coldly. "The only difference is that now everyone else will know it. Read the paper, Richard. Or I stop the broadcast right now, and you go straight to a maximum security cell." Richard swallowed hard. Tears of profound humiliation spilled over his eyelashes, cutting through the sweat on his face. He looked down at the legal document resting on the white linen tablecloth. His voice shook violently as he began to read. "My name is Richard Moore," he croaked. He paused, struggling to force the words past the massive lump forming in his throat. "Keep going," I commanded. "My name is Richard Moore," he repeated louder. His eyes locked onto the glowing phone screen. "I am the former owner of a logistics company that went completely bankrupt 24 months ago. I have been insolvent and hiding from my creditors. To maintain my lavish lifestyle, I engaged in massive corporate tax evasion and took out predatory loans I knew I could never repay." Catherine let out an agonizing, guttural wail from the floor. She buried her face in the expensive restaurant carpet, completely unable to watch her pristine social status disintegrate in real time. The live viewer count crossed 400. The comment section was exploding with shocked, angry reactions from hedge fund managers and socialites who had just realized they had been dining with a con artist. "Read the rest," I demanded. "Read what you did to your own daughter." Richard squeezed his eyes shut for a brief second before forcing himself to look back at the relentless camera lens. "I falsely accused my daughter Caroline of embezzlement 5 years ago," Richard confessed, his voice breaking under the crushing weight of his own crimes. "I fired her and ruined her professional reputation to protect my youngest daughter, Ashley, who had actually stolen the money. Furthermore, I confessed to committing first-degree mortgage fraud. I walked into First National Bank and forged Caroline's signature to steal $50,000 in home equity to pay for Ashley's wedding. Everything I have told my friends and colleagues for the past 5 years is a complete and total lie." The live chat on the screen was moving so fast the comments were a blur. The humiliation was absolute, permanent, and entirely public. Richard's legacy was reduced to dust in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. I ended the live stream. I saved the video locally to my encrypted cloud drive and locked my phone. The digital execution was officially complete. I picked up the sleek black pen and held it out to him. The police officers temporarily loosened their grip on his arms, allowing him just enough movement to lean forward over the table. Richard took the pen with a shaking hand. He scribbled his signature across the bottom of the confession document. He dropped the pen looking completely and utterly broken. "It is done," Richard whispered, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "I did what you wanted. I confessed to everyone. Now tell the police to back off. Tell them we have a civil settlement." I carefully picked up the signed document. I checked the signature, folded the heavy paper neatly, and slid it safely into my handbag. I looked at Richard with a perfectly calm expression. "I promised to reduce my corporate financial claims to a civil settlement," I said softly. "And I will keep that promise. Vanguard Capital will not pursue a criminal trial for the massive corporate debt you owe us. You will just be entirely bankrupt." Richard let out a massive, shaky sigh of relief. He actually thought he had won his freedom. He genuinely thought the public humiliation had bought his way out of handcuffs. He rolled his shoulders, waiting for the officers to release him so he could stand up. Instead, the lead detective stepped forward. He grabbed Richard's arms with forceful, aggressive authority, yanking them firmly behind his back. The metal teeth of the handcuffs clicked loudly, tightening around Richard's wrists with a sharp, unforgiving grip. "Wait!" Richard shouted, panic surging rapidly back into his voice. "What are you doing? She just said we have a civil settlement. The debt is settled. Let me go." The lead detective looked at my father with pure professional disgust. "Corporate debt is a civil matter," the detective stated flatly. "But forging a signature to commit real estate fraud is a state felony. Your daughter controls the civil settlement, but the Manhattan District Attorney controls the criminal warrants. You are still going to jail tonight." The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs locking around Richard's wrists echoed through the VIP room with absolute finality. The sound severed the very last thread of the Moore family dynasty. Richard slumped forward, his spirit entirely broken, as the two uniformed officers hauled him to his feet. Catherine remained a weeping mess on the imported carpet, her ruined silk blouse stained with tears and spilled wine. Across the long mahogany table, Ashley sat completely frozen. For 31 years, she had existed in a perfect, impenetrable bubble of extreme privilege. She was the golden child. She was the beautiful, untouchable daughter who never faced a single consequence for her actions. If she overspent her credit cards, Richard covered the bill without question. If she stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from the family company, Catherine gladly blamed me. If she wanted a multi-million-dollar lifestyle she did not earn, she simply manipulated her husband into committing federal wire fraud. There was always a safety net. There was always a designated scapegoat ready to take the fall. But as Ashley looked around the devastated private dining room, the horrifying reality of her new existence finally crashed down on her. Donovan was currently being shoved into the back of a federal vehicle, taking her access to corporate wealth with him. Richard and Catherine were being read their Miranda rights. Their bank accounts flagged their massive Greenwich mansion legally seized by my equity firm. Her young personal trainer would abandon her. The absolute second he realized the offshore accounts were locked down by federal investigators. Her luxury condo was purchased with stolen corporate funds, meaning the government would seize it by dawn. No one was coming to save her. She had absolutely nothing left. Ashley stood up. Her heavy chair scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was disheveled, and her expensive designer makeup was smudged darkly around her eyes. The polished elite socialite was completely gone. She looked absolutely feral. "You cannot do this!" Ashley screamed. Her voice was shrill, desperate, and entirely devoid of its usual arrogant control. "You cannot just take everything. My condo, my cars, my money. You cannot take my money, Caroline. I deserve that money. I am the one who is supposed to be successful. You are nothing but a jealous, pathetic loser." I looked at my younger sister with profound, unwavering exhaustion. "You do not have any money, Ashley. You have a mountain of stolen assets that the federal government is going to seize before you even wake up tomorrow. You are going to be investigated as a co-conspirator in a massive wire fraud case. You are completely broke and you are entirely on your own." The words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. The absolute finality in my voice stripped away the very last of her delusions. She looked at the police officers standing behind her father, fully expecting them to step in and protect her, just like her parents always had. But the officers were busy securing Richard. They did not care about a spoiled, entitled woman losing her stolen fortune. A dark, violent shadow crossed Ashley's face. The sheer panic in her eyes instantly morphed into blind, homicidal rage. She could not handle the total destruction of her ego. She could not process a world where I was the billionaire victor and she was the destitute criminal. If her perfect life was going up in flames, she was determined to drag me into the fire with her. Ashley's wild eyes darted down to the table. Resting right next to her untouched plate, gleaming under the bright light of the crystal chandeliers, was a heavy serrated steak knife. It happened in a fraction of a second. Ashley snatched the wooden handle of the steak knife. She let out a guttural, terrifying shriek that sounded more animal than human. She threw her entire body weight forward, lunging directly across the wide mahogany table. She knocked over wine bottles and floral arrangements, her arm raised high, the sharp serrated blade aimed straight for my face. Catherine screamed from the floor. Richard yelled out in pure shock. I did not even flinch. I did not take a single step backward. Before Ashley could even clear the center of the dining table, Alexander's elite security detail moved with terrifying explosive precision. The guard standing to my immediate right lunged forward. He intercepted Ashley mid-air, his massive hand clamping down brutally hard on her right wrist. He twisted her arm sharply, forcing a sickening pop that echoed loudly in the room. Ashley shrieked in sudden, blinding agony. Her fingers flew open. The heavy steak knife dropped from her grip, clattering harmlessly against a porcelain dinner plate before skidding off the table and hitting the floor. A second guard flanked her instantly. Together they grabbed Ashley by her shoulders and slammed her face first down onto the white linen tablecloth. The impact sent empty wine glasses and heavy silverware crashing to the floor in a chaotic shower of broken crystal. They pinned her arms painfully behind her back, locking her firmly against the hard wood of the dining table so she could not move a single muscle. Alexander stepped smoothly in front of me, placing his tall frame as a physical barrier between my body and the table, though the threat was already completely neutralized. His gray eyes were dark with absolute freezing fury as he looked down at the struggling woman. "Restrain her," Alexander ordered his guards, his voice vibrating with lethal, unforgiving authority. "If she moves a single inch, break her arm." The guards pressed their weight down harder. Ashley thrashed wildly against the table, kicking her expensive heels against the air, sobbing and screaming in total unhinged hysteria. The police officers who had been securing Richard immediately rushed forward, pulling out a third pair of steel handcuffs to take over the physical restraint from the private security team. "You planned this!" Ashley shrieked at the top of her lungs, her cheek pressed hard against the spilled wine soaking into the tablecloth. She glared up at me, her eyes wild with furious, hateful tears. "You set this whole thing up. You waited 5 years to destroy my life. You knew Donovan would steal that money. You knew Dad was bankrupt. You manipulated all of us just so you could take my house and humiliate me. You planned this for years, you psycho." I stepped out from behind Alexander. I walked right up to the edge of the table, looking down at the golden child who was now being officially restrained by the New York Police Department. I stared at her ruined designer dress, her smeared makeup, and the absolute terrifying desperation shining in her eyes. "I did not plan anything," I said, my voice cold, steady, and dropping into a sharp whisper that completely silenced the chaotic room. "I did not force Donovan to commit federal wire fraud. I did not force Mom and Dad to forge bank documents. And I certainly did not force you to sleep with your personal trainer behind your husband's back." I leaned down just a fraction closer, letting my words cut through the last remaining shreds of her pathetic, shattered ego. "I didn't plan anything," I stated with absolute terrifying finality. "I just stopped protecting you from your own stupidity." The absolute finality of my words drained the last ounce of fight out of Ashley. Her thrashing ceased entirely. She lay pinned against the ruined white tablecloth, her cheek resting in a puddle of spilled red wine, staring at me with hollow, defeated eyes. The New York police officers wasted no time. They pulled her roughly off the dining table, twisting her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic click of a third pair of handcuffs snapping shut echoed through the VIP room. She was no longer just a suspect in a federal wire fraud conspiracy. She was now under arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. Alexander did not spare my sister another glance. He turned his imposing frame away from the shattered crystal on the floor and focused his freezing gray eyes entirely on the man trembling between two federal agents. Donovan shrank back, his custom-tailored suit wrinkled and stained. The arrogant chief financial officer, who had spent the entire evening mocking my apartment and my career, was completely gone. He looked like a terrified child waiting for a beating. Alexander adjusted his jacket, his expression completely devoid of mercy. Donovan Hayes. Alexander announced, his deep voice carrying the undeniable weight of a corporate executioner. Your employment at Prescott Industries is terminated effective immediately. You are fired for cause specifically gross misconduct, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate theft. Donovan let out a pathetic strangled sob, but Alexander was not finished. As per the morality and fraud clauses in your executive contract. Alexander continued with ruthless precision, I am officially voiding your entire severance package. I am stripping you of all unvested stock options. My legal team has already filed the emergency paperwork to claw back every single performance bonus you received over the past 36 months. You will not see another dime from my corporation. You are leaving this company with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your back and a federal indictment. Please, Donovan begged, tears streaming down his face. Mr. Prescott, I have nothing else. If you claw back my bonuses, I cannot even afford a defense attorney. I will be assigned a public defender against the federal government. You are throwing my entire life into a wood chipper. You threw your own life into a wood chipper the second you bypassed my security protocols to steal my capital, Alexander replied coldly. Take him out of my sight. The two federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division did not hesitate. They grabbed Donovan by his arms and spun him around. One of the agents pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, locking them tightly around Donovan's wrists. The agent began reading him his rights in a sharp, monotonous voice, detailing the federal wire fraud charges that would inevitably put him behind bars for decades. Donovan looked over his shoulder one last time. He looked at Ashley, who was crying hysterically while the local police held her arms. The husband and wife stared at each other fully, realizing that their shared greed and mutual betrayals had completely destroyed them both. The federal agents shoved Donovan forward, marching the disgraced executive out of the private dining room and down the hallway toward the waiting government vehicles. I stood silently next to my husband, watching the synchronized destruction of my toxic family. It was a scene of absolute poetic justice. Richard was slumped in the grip of two officers, his face pale and sweating, his fraudulent logistics empire and his fake heart conditions completely dismantled. Catherine was weeping loudly on the expensive carpet, her diamond necklace sitting crookedly against her torn silk blouse, her high society status completely evaporated. Ashley was sobbing in restraints, her golden child immunity permanently revoked. And Donovan was already on his way to a federal holding cell. They were all going down simultaneously. The arrogant, abusive dynasty they had built on a foundation of lies, stolen equity, and relentless cruelty had collapsed in less than an hour. They were leaving the restaurant with absolutely nothing. No mansions, no luxury cars, no offshore accounts, and zero dignity. The police officers began coordinating their exit. They hauled Catherine up from the floor, ignoring her dramatic protests. They commanded Richard to walk forward. They pushed Ashley toward the heavy oak doors. The entire family was being grouped together for the ultimate humiliating march through the main dining room of the exclusive Manhattan restaurant. As the chaotic cluster of police officers and crying criminals moved toward the exit, the heavy oak doors swung open wider. Standing nervously in the hallway was the general manager of the restaurant. He was a distinguished older gentleman in a pristine tuxedo, but right now he looked absolutely terrified. He had clearly been waiting outside the soundproof doors, listening to the screaming, the breaking glass, and the arrival of federal law enforcement. He stepped hesitantly into the ruined VIP room, carefully avoiding the shattered wine glasses and the dropped steak knife on the floor. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the armed private security guards flanking Alexander. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. In his trembling hands he held a sleek black leather folder. The manager slowly approached the spot where Alexander and I were standing. He looked at my parents in handcuffs, then looked down at the floor, clearly wanting to be anywhere else in the world. He cleared his throat, his voice shaking with profound discomfort. "Excuse me, Mr. Prescott," Madam the manager stammered, bowing his head slightly. "I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt this legal situation. But per our restaurant policy, we cannot close out the private dining reservation until the final balance is settled." He timidly extended his shaking hand, presenting the black leather folder to us. It contained the massive, extravagant Christmas dinner bill that my parents had confidently expected me to pay. The general manager stepped hesitantly into the ruined private dining room, carefully avoiding a shattered crystal wine glass and a pool of spilled Chardonnay on the expensive carpet. He was a distinguished older man in a tailored tuxedo, but right now his hands shook slightly as he approached us. The room was a chaotic crime scene, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers parked outside on the Manhattan street. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously toward the armed private security guards flanking my husband. "I am so incredibly sorry to interrupt this legal situation, Mr. Prescott," Madam the manager stammered, bowing his head respectfully. "But per our restaurant policy, we cannot close out the private dining reservation until the final balance is settled." He timidly extended his shaking hand, presenting a sleek black leather folder to me. I took the heavy folder and opened it. I glanced down at the itemized receipt printed on crisp white paper. $4,000. My family had gorged themselves on imported caviar, premium cuts of steak, and multiple bottles of vintage champagne. They had ordered the most expensive items on the menu, fully expecting to force me into signing away my condominium to cover their lavish, arrogant lifestyle. Now they were standing in steel handcuffs, completely bankrupt, and staring at a massive dinner bill they had absolutely no way of paying. Catherine sniffled loudly from the floor. The cold metal of the police cuffs severely restricted her movement, and her ruined silk blouse was covered in dust, but her deep-rooted narcissistic entitlement remained perfectly intact. "Caroline," she pleaded, her voice dropping into a pathetic, whining whimper. "You have to pay that bill. The detectives already searched Richard and took his wallet for evidence, and my credit cards are in my purse, which they confiscated. We do not have a single dollar to our names right now. You are a billionaire. $4,000 is absolute pocket change to you. Please just pay the restaurant so they do not press theft charges on top of everything else." I looked at the woman kneeling on the floor. I looked at Richard, who turned his face away, deeply humiliated, but clearly hoping I would bail them out one last time. I looked at Ashley, who was still sobbing against the white linen tablecloth, completely destroyed by the loss of her stolen fortune. They had spent the entire evening mocking my clothes, my apartment, and my supposed poverty. They had threatened to ruin my life and render me homeless. Now, facing federal prison, they were begging me to buy their dinner. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no lingering sense of obligation. I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my limitless titanium black card. I handed it smoothly to the manager. "Put the entire balance on this," I instructed calmly. "And please add a generous 20% gratuity for your waitstaff. They have had to deal with an incredibly unpleasant table tonight." The manager bowed his head, profound relief washing over his face. "Thank you so much, madam. I will run this immediately." He turned and hurried out of the room, eager to escape the suffocating tension. Catherine let out a massive, shaky breath. She actually tried to smile through her smeared makeup and her tears. "Thank you, Caroline." She sniffled, her voice taking on a sickeningly sweet tone. "I knew you would not let us starve or get arrested for stealing food. Deep down, I know you still care about us. You are still my daughter." I stared at my mother, absolutely astounded by her delusional arrogance. She was facing federal prison for first-degree identity theft. She had just admitted on a live broadcast that she tried to destroy me out of pure jealousy. Yet she genuinely believed that paying for her steak dinner was a sign of lingering familial devotion. She thought I was acting out of love. The manager returned a moment later. He handed back my titanium card along with the final receipt. I signed my name with a smooth, deliberate motion. I handed the folder back to him and thanked him for his discretion. Then I reached into my handbag one final time. I pulled out my leather wallet and opened it. I bypassed the high-limit credit cards and extracted a single crisp $10 bill. I walked slowly toward the center of the ruined dining table. I bypassed the scattered federal bankruptcy filings, the bank fraud evidence, and the photos of Ashley's affair. I dropped the $10 bill right onto the center of the white linen tablecloth, placing it directly in the eye line of my handcuffed parents and my sobbing sister. "What is that?" Richard asked, his voice rough and confused, as he stared at the small bill resting on the table. "That is a tip," I replied. My voice dropped to a freezing, lethal whisper that carried clearly across the silent room. "But it is not for the waitstaff. I already tipped them on the card. That $10 bill is for you, Catherine, and for you, Richard, and for your precious golden child." I leaned in slightly, making sure every single word cut straight through their fragile egos and settled deep into their bones. "I paid the restaurant bill because I respect the people who work here," I stated with absolute terrifying finality. "But that $10 on the table is my final contribution to this family. That is exactly what this bloodline is worth to me." The $10 bill rested perfectly still on the white linen tablecloth. Catherine stared at the crisp paper, her hysterical weeping suddenly cutting off into a silent, breathless shock. The tiny denomination was the ultimate insult to a woman who had spent her entire life measuring human worth in luxury cars, massive real estate portfolios, and country club memberships. She finally understood the absolute finality of my gesture. There was no more manipulation left to play, no more safety nets to catch her. The well of my forgiveness was completely dry. The lead detective stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence in the room. "All right, let us move out," he ordered his officers. "We have a long night of processing ahead of us." The officers hauled Richard forward. He stumbled immediately, his expensive leather shoes dragging heavily against the imported carpet. He did not look at me. He did not look at the $10 bill. He just stared blankly at the floor, utterly defeated by the crushing reality of his incoming federal prison sentence. Catherine was pulled roughly to her feet. She tried to resist, her knees buckling beneath her torn silk blouse, but the female officer held her firmly by the arm, leaving her absolutely no room to negotiate. Ashley was the loudest. As the officers guided her toward the heavy oak doors, she twisted her body against their grip, screaming a chaotic string of obscenities. She cursed Donovan for getting caught by the internal auditors. She cursed our parents for going bankrupt and failing to protect her. She cursed me for surviving the very trap she had set. Her voice was shrill, desperate, and completely unhinged. Alexander gave a brief nod to his private security detail. The massive guards stepped aside and pulled the heavy oak doors of the VIP room fully open. The sound of the main dining room washed over us, but it did not last long. Le Cuckoo was completely packed. It was Christmas week in Manhattan, and the restaurant was filled with the exact demographic my parents worshipped. The tables were occupied by Wall Street executives, influential real estate tycoons, and old money socialites. As the police marched my family out of the private room, the entire restaurant went dead silent. The soft jazz music playing over the overhead speakers seemed to amplify the sharp metallic clinking of the steel handcuffs. The walk of shame began. It was the ultimate social execution. Catherine tried desperately to hide her face behind her messy, ruined blonde hair. She kept her chin tucked tightly against her chest, but it was entirely useless. The very people she used to play golf with at the Greenwich Heritage Club were sitting at the premium tables holding their champagne flutes, watching her being paraded out like a common street criminal. The social death was absolute and permanent. A loud wave of murmurs and shocked whispers rippled through the dining room. I watched several wealthy patrons immediately pull out their smartphones. The bright flashes of cameras illuminated the dimly lit restaurant as Manhattan's elite eagerly documented the spectacular downfall of the Moore family. Catherine let out a pathetic whimper, trying to turn her face away from the lenses, but the police officers kept her moving forward at a brisk, unforgiving pace. Richard walked with a heavy, broken limp, his shoulders rounded and defeated. The mighty, arrogant patriarch who loved to boast about his massive logistics empire was reduced to a pathetic fraud on public display. Several prominent businessmen who had previously invested in his ventures watched him pass with expressions of profound disgust, already calculating how quickly they needed to call their own legal teams. Ashley continued to sob hysterically, completely unable to accept her new reality. Her expensive mascara was smeared darkly down her cheeks. Her designer dress was wrinkled and heavily stained with spilled red wine from her vicious physical fight on the floor. As the police guided her through the grand foyer, she looked directly at a table of women she recognized from her exclusive social circles. She opened her mouth, leaning toward them, as if to beg for help or demand an intervention. The women simply turned their faces away in pure revulsion, completely icing her out. The officers marched them past the host stand and pushed open the heavy glass front doors. They were shoved out into the freezing New York winter night. The flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers illuminated the falling snow, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare over their ruined faces. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing out the cold air and the wailing sirens. The spectacle was officially over. Inside the VIP room, the general manager stood near the shattered crystal on the floor, looking completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the chaos that had just unfolded in his establishment. Alexander stepped forward and dismissed him with a quiet, authoritative word, assuring the man that Prescott Industries would fully compensate the restaurant for any physical damages to the room by morning. The manager bowed deeply, expressing his profound gratitude, and hurried out. He pulled the heavy oak doors shut behind him with a soft, definitive click. For the first time all evening, the room was perfectly quiet. The screaming was gone. The toxic manipulation was gone. The crushing weight of 35 years of emotional abuse had completely evaporated into the Manhattan night. I stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty chairs, the ruined property deed, and the $10 bill still resting on the table. I took a deep, steadying breath, feeling a massive, unprecedented wave of pure freedom wash over my entire body. Alexander walked slowly over to the dining table. He bypassed the spilled food and the scattered legal documents. He picked up the one surviving bottle of vintage red wine that had not been knocked over during Ashley's violent tantrum. He reached for two clean crystal glasses resting on a side cart and poured the remaining dark liquid evenly between them. He walked back to my side and handed me a glass. His gray eyes were warm, filled with a deep, quiet pride. I took the crystal glass from his hand. We stood together in the middle of the beautiful wrecked room, the silence wrapping around us like a protective shield. Alexander raised his glass slightly. "To a very peaceful Christmas," he said softly. I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached all the way to my eyes. I raised my glass to meet his. The delicate crystal chimed with a clear, beautiful note. We stood there together, drinking the last of the wine in absolute, unbroken peace. I set my empty crystal glass down on the edge of the ruined mahogany table. The sharp chime of the crystal meeting. The wood felt like a final gavel, striking in a courtroom. I did not look at the scattered bankruptcy files covering the white linen. I did not look at the torn property deed that was supposed to render me homeless. I definitely did not look at the $10 bill resting alone in the center of the destruction. The past was completely dead, and I had absolutely no intention of attending its funeral. Alexander placed his hand firmly on the small of my back. His touch was a grounding, powerful force, guiding me toward the heavy oak doors. We stepped out of the VIP room and into the main dining area of the restaurant. The ambient chatter of Manhattan's elite immediately dropped to a hushed, reverent whisper. The live string quartet playing in the corner had completely stopped. Wall Street executives, real estate tycoons, and high society figures parted seamlessly to clear a wide path for us. They had just watched a fraudulent, arrogant dynasty get dragged out into the winter night in steel handcuffs. Now they were watching the billionaire architect of that destruction walk out with his head held high. Nobody dared to speak a single word. Nobody dared to pull out a smartphone to record us. The level of respect and sheer intimidation in the room was absolute. We walked past the premium tables without rushing, entirely unbothered by the hundreds of eyes tracking our every move. We reached the grand foyer at the front of the establishment. The coat check attendant nervously handed Alexander his heavy tailored cashmere overcoat, his hands shaking slightly as he offered the garment to the CEO. Alexander did not put the coat on himself. He turned to me and draped the thick, warm fabric directly over my shoulders, shielding my silk designer dress from the impending chill of the lobby. I pulled the lapels tight across my chest, breathing in the faint, comforting scent of his expensive cologne. The restaurant host rushed forward, pushing the heavy glass double doors wide open for us. We stepped out into the freezing New York night. The frigid, biting wind whipped across my face, but it did not feel harsh or punishing. It felt incredibly clean. It felt like breathing pure, unfiltered oxygen for the very first time in 35 years. Thick white snowflakes were falling rapidly from the dark, cloudy sky, coating the Manhattan sidewalks in a pristine, untouched layer of white. The chaotic noise of the city seemed completely muffled by the falling snow, creating a pocket of profound, isolating quiet around us. I stood on the curb looking down the long, snow-covered avenue. 3 blocks away, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers were already fading into the dense, creeping city traffic. They were taking Richard to a federal processing center, where his boasting would mean absolutely nothing. They were taking Catherine to a concrete holding cell entirely stripped of her pearls, her luxury brands, and her vicious pride. They were taking Ashley to face the horrifying, inescapable reality of a frozen bank account and a criminal indictment. They were taking Donovan to answer for $2 million in stolen corporate funds. I watched the sirens disappear completely around the corner, swallowing the flashing lights until the street returned to a normal, steady glow. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to cry or panic or question my ruthless choices. I felt a profound, unbreakable sense of total victory. They had spent my entire life trying to crush my spirit, trying to mold me into a compliant, silent scapegoat who existed only to absorb their failures. They had thrown me out into a brutal blizzard 5 years ago, fully expecting me to freeze to death and beg for their conditional mercy. But I did not freeze. I built a financial fortress. I became the storm, and tonight I let that storm bury them permanently. The sleek midnight black Maybach pulled up smoothly to the curb, its heavy tires crunching softly against the fresh snow. Alexander's private driver stepped out, instantly moving with military precision. He opened the heavy rear door and stood at strict attention, waiting for us to board. Alexander turned to me. He gently adjusted the collar of the cashmere coat resting on my shoulders, making sure the freezing wind could not reach me. He looked down at me, his striking gray eyes catching the soft golden glow of the streetlights filtering through the falling snow. "Where to?" "Mrs. Prescott," he asked, his voice a deep, resonant rumble against the quiet winter night. I looked up at the man who had stood by my side while I dismantled my abusers piece by piece. A genuine, entirely relaxed smile spread across my face. "Home," I replied with absolute certainty. "I never have to deal with them again." Alexander smiled back, a fiercely protective expression that belonged entirely to me. We stepped into the warm, luxurious interior of the Maybach. The heavy armored door pulled shut with a solid, definitive thud, completely sealing out the cold and the noise of the city. The driver smoothly merged the massive vehicle back into the flow of traffic. I leaned my head against my husband's shoulder as the car accelerated down the avenue, vanishing seamlessly into the bright, endless expanse of the New York City lights. The greatest lesson from this story is that true security never comes from seeking the approval of toxic people. For years, Caroline allowed her family to dictate her worth, accepting their abuse just because they shared blood. She ultimately realized that family is defined by mutual respect, not DNA. By building her own empire and fiercely protecting her boundaries, she permanently stripped away their power and reclaimed her life. You never have to set yourself on fire to keep manipulative people warm. If you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives, please share your experience and comment below.